Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the week as much as I am.
Yes.
I'm gonna go home to sleep, though. Um, Miriam, a very interesting woman, but there is actually very little in the Bible about her. We have three main things that, no, I don't need that.
Okay, sorry.
I'm gonna use my notes, but no how. There are three main things we know about Miriam as we surface read, in the scriptures. Her role in being with her baby brother. We're going to talk about some of these things. Her dancing at the sea with the women after their great deliverance from Pharaoh, and later with some very unsavory things that went on in the camp. And we don't hear about Miriam after that. How many of us would really like to have our life remembered by one incident of something that happened? And there's nothing after that to say, oh, but everything turned out right. You know? And so we're going to discuss some of this, but first I want to go through a little bit of a progression of what was happening to Israel, because it does help us up until the time that we're talking about. And we're actually living through this ourselves, as Paul says, right? Those things were for us examples, so that we would not repeat what they did, so we would learn from their mistakes and not make those mistakes ourselves. And I think that's a wonderful rule of life, no matter whether you're scripturally oriented or not. If you learn from the mistakes of your parents, or you learn from your own mistakes that you did in the past, it's progress in life, right? And so in Genesis 40, this whole thing sort of starts, because that was when they ended up finishing the tabernacle. Exodus 40, yes. Exodus 40, the first day of the first month of the second year. They had come to the mountain 7 weeks after Passover, and that was, of course, they were about 9 months there at the foot of the mountain, receiving the law and learning a new way to live as Yahweh's covenant precious people, right? He said, you are my segula, the most precious possession I own. Like a king going in and saying, this is the piece of whatever I have that I treasure over everything else. What a picture, because was Israel perfect? No, they had been slaves. They had a lot of bad habits. They had a lot of things going on that weren't good, but he sees the end from the beginning, like he does in our lives. And he was in the process of transforming them into an entity that was to go out and proselytize, to share the gospel, because there was a gospel in the Old Testament. We think that's a New Testament thing. No. The good news of salvation has been from the very beginning. So when we say Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, we don't really understand exactly what that means, and we take Paul and run with it, and we really don't allow the Father to show us this covenant never changed. He just gave it to different generations and added sometimes symbols to it and other things. But it's the same covenant. The covenant that was an everlasting covenant. It was for the salvation of humankind or anyone who sinned. And it actually was even for Satan, if you think about it. Lucifer and the angels had choice. If they had not had choice, they would have been destroyed before any of this happened. But he had to share news with all of the created worlds, with the other angels, to help them understand what sin was, and so that it would never be repeated again. And that's how he can say with confidence, and we can, sin will never raise its ugly head again. We'll all totally understand, 100%. Nobody will want it. If you ended up burning down your house with some foolish thing that happened, like our houses burned down from somebody putting a space heater or a small unvented heater in a bedroom, open the window, curtains are flying back and forth across it, and then leave the room, go downstairs, and expect house to be warmed? That's foolishness, right? So when you end up having the house burned down with something stupid, would you ever do that again? Or leaving Christmas lights on that people do when they burn houses down with those things. So electricity has to be understood, otherwise we have problems, right? Well, I want to go into a little bit of this sequence of where we are. After the tabernacle was set up, we get into the book of Numbers and we find out that after 7 days, their walk to the sea had been accomplished. They say that they went through the sea on the 7th day of unleavened bread. And that's very significant because what is baptism? We talk about that as being a symbol of going through immersion, right? It's never going back to your old way of life. It's cleaning out the past and starting anew. And the Father said, you're never to come this way again. You're never to go back to Mitzrayim, that land where you were in bondage. Freedom is yours. But it was a choice. And they went from there, they crossed the Red Sea, and they had, the next thing that we see is in Numbers, where we have the first day of the second month, in the second year, I should say the first day of the first month in the second year, which they actually celebrated Passover for the first time outside of Egypt. And then, in the second month, they took a census. Now, censuses were something David was told he couldn't do. He was punished for it, right? But this is a census that Yahweh was taking, and it's really for our benefit to see that their whole sojourn through the wilderness, their numbers never diminished. Yes, they had people dying off because of sin and these things, but there were children being born. There were things that were keeping, essentially, their population almost the same when they entered into the land. So life kind of went on as usual. And we also can see that the 20th day of the second month, which was only 6 days later, they departed from Sinai. And they had to have that census done so that they would be an orderly nation. They would leave in a certain order. There were certain positions where they would have various articles of the sanctuary in that process. And our Father is a person of order. He's not one of chaos and just spontaneous, knee-jerk, whatever. He doesn't do that. And if we want that characteristic of our Father, we need to be observing Passover. Why? Because we clean our houses out of all the junk that accumulates during the year, right? That's where spring cleaning came from. And in the fall of the year, 6 months later, 6, the number of men, we kind of tend to reclutter, don't we? Here again, heart-searching stuff. Get that out. Get your heart clean. Father wants order in our lives. There is a saying that says, our house reflects our mind. Ooh, some of us might not like that, right? We want our house clean. If it's not clean, we don't want anybody coming in. We don't want them to see our clutter. And that's a woman thing. But basically, it's a spiritual concept that our minds have to be ordered, our lives have to be ordered. It wasn't in the Bible, but cleanliness is next to godliness. So these are concepts that kind of help to make our lives different from the world. Well, after they ended up departing from Sinai, this was the first time, of course, and the cloud lifted from the sanctuary, and they were to follow the cloud. Whether they went for a day and camped, 3 days and camped, or months and camped, or longer, they were to follow the cloud. They did not have any idea of what tomorrow would bring. They had to rely totally on the leading and guidance of Yeshua, because he was the one in the cloud, right? There were some interesting things that happened. Numbers 11, they started complaining. This is the old self, the unregenerated, characters that just couldn't handle the stress. They had taken probably food, as we can see, because we know that 3 days after the crossing of the Red Sea, they came to Mara, right? and that means bitter water. That was where they thought they could refill their jugs. They could end up, having some water for their animals and things. And yet, complaining that you brought us out here to die, no trust, no trust. There was complaining after that. They ended up having fire burn among these complainers. And Ellen tells us that they were, a lot of them, the mixed multitude, people who had come along, having seen the marvelous things that happened to them in Egypt with the plagues. And they were newbies, right? Totally. They didn't have the background that the Israelites had. And so you can't very well expect them to operate on the same level as Israel. We can see that through the sojourn. And this all happened kind of at the outskirts of the camp. And Moses had to pray, and the fire came down. This was called Tibera, burning or blaze, and this was in the wilderness of Paran. And then, just a few verses later, they were lusting for Egypt's food. Moses heard, he says, "Why are you complaining against me? I can't handle this." And Moses complained to Yahweh and said, "Why in the world have you put me in charge of these babes?" Right? All they do is complain. "Oh, I can't handle this. These are your people." But the father said, "I will take care of it. We'll give them food." And so he did. He gave them instructions that they would have quail come in. And what did they do? They gathered, they say cubits deep. You're talking about quail that are 18 inches to 2 feet or more, than that, just laying on the ground, and they were picking up all this stuff and drying it and carrying it, trying to provide for themselves, restock their food supplies. Where's their faith? Did they learn that lesson? Well, no, they didn't, because we'll learn further on they did it again. The response that the Father gave to them was completely different. And so we come to another spot. Oh, excuse me, the name of that place was Kibroth Hattawa, which means graves of lust and craving. And that was the second time they named it. But he said to them something very interesting. He said, "You're going to have to eat this for not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20." Why was he putting all these numbers in here? "But for a month of days, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes an abomination to you because you rejected Yahuwah." Do we sometimes need those kinds of lessons when we want things we shouldn't have? He says, "I'll make it so abhorrent to you that you won't even want it anymore." He did that to me with sugar. I told him, "Do whatever you have to do. I don't want to eat it." That's my resolve. It gives me cramps in my legs and everything else. I said, I don't want that stuff. But don't we all kind of, gravitate to it? It tastes good and whatnot. Well, he did. He answered my prayer. Whenever I eat that stuff, I'll spend half the night trying to calm down things in my legs. It's like, I am so sorry. I really need to repent because I told you to do this and you're just following my instructions, right? So we see that Israel really had a lot of problems, and we do too. We can relate to them. Going on in this narrative, after the census was taken, they did a ransom of the firstborn. Now that's interesting. They were taking a patriarchal system where the firstborn became the next patriarch and passed spiritual things on and were the head of the spiritual family, to choosing a tribe, the tribe of Levi, to take their place. And it was the formation of a nation where they were going to have codified laws. They were going to have people that were serving in the tabernacle. They were going to have a completely different way of life, though it would still follow, a godly course. And so these were things that are very interesting. And From that, we get a lot of different laws in Leviticus that we don't understand real well. And one of them Bob touched on the other day, and it was the law of the lepers. What they had to do was quite complex. And it's interesting that there is something in the sanctuary that we have not actually focused on in Adventism, and it's actually very new. This was only discovered about 25, 30 years ago, and it was a very unique vessel that was at the door of the tabernacle. And in the Bible, it's called the vessel. You'll see that he alluded to it, where the man had to be cleansed. There had to be things of very interesting nature that accompanied this ceremony. And what were they? Do you remember? Cedar, wood, a red cord, of course, water, and in some cases, ashes of the red heifer. I didn't hear what you said.
Hyssop.
Hyssop, that's right. And these things have spiritual meaning. These things were all part of this cleansing ceremony that the lepers went through, that had to happen when a house was infected with tzara, which is not necessarily leprosy. It's a condition more like mold. Anything that is yeast, mold, leprosy, skin conditions that were not curable to them, these were all in a category called tzara, and that was what we now term throughout our Bibles as leprosy. But no, it really isn't all leprosy. But they are conditions that are very, very bad and severe to health and can cause tremendous problems. And each one of them, if they could not control it or get rid of it, it caused the demise of whatever. Whether it was the house, they had to tear it down. Or if it's a person, of course they die, right? So these things were a part of a spiritual concept that we understand better today than they did, I'm sure. But they were types of how cleansing occurs. And that vessel represented Christ. He was simple. He was made, they say pottery in some of the Bible, earthen vessel. No, it actually was a vessel that was made from white stone that had all little fragments of all of the various precious stones that are in the ephod of the priest. And all of these things, and of course, when we have Revelation in the description of the city that's coming down, the foundation stones are all of different colors. All of those stones are little fragments in this white stone of this vessel. This was interesting because as they found this vessel, and that's a whole nother story I can't get into, but it was found in one of the Emirates in a no man's land area in a shop that was very unique. It just looked like a hole in the wall, and the father told the woman who was there, just shopping for souvenirs, go in here. And she did, and in there was a man dressed in white, very much the garb that's been there for thousands of years, with a leather belt on. And she said, are these things for sale? And he said, yes. And she was directed to one thing, and it was a very simple vessel, probably about this big. And it was a pot, and she said, is this for sale? Yes. Well, in Arab countries, you don't just accept a price. They think you're absolutely stupid if you do that. Everybody bargains, right? They'll kind of wink and carry on behind your back if you say, oh, okay, and you hand out the money and you don't bargain. They kind of consider your little dance. Because in those countries, that's all part of the process of buying something. And so they put the price higher always. They want you to bargain it down. They want to be able to have some conversation with you. Well, she tried that. And he said, no, it's a fixed price. That was unusual for Arab country. But she bought it. Guess how much it cost? $30. She was going to bring that and other souvenirs back to the States when she came, and everything in her suitcase that she brought as souvenirs was actually damaged in transit, except this vessel. She put it up on a bookshelf in her home. And one day, as they were studying Torah, where it talked about this vessel, she said, this vessel's very unique and probably very similar to what that's talking about. And as they took it down and they were looking at it, there was a light and a voice in the room that said, take that and put it in a very special place. Wrap it in white linen, put it away, go cleanse yourselves, don't touch this, it's holy. Now go study, find out what this is. She did. She went to Fort, got a doctoral degree studying this vessel with a lot of ancient documents and things, and said, wow, we think this was the vessel that was used in the wilderness tabernacle. Now, when Dr. Carl Baugh heard about this, he's the Creation Museum in Plymouth, Texas, founder, he contacted them and said, that needs to be analyzed by a laboratory. We need to find out more about it. They didn't have the money for this, and he said, I'll pay for it. They did. It cost about $30,000. And the people analyzing the stuff had no idea, really. They had pictures of it, but very high powered pictures and showing much of the detail, professionally done. And they did scrapings on the inside of this vessel, and that's what they sent to the lab. The lab came back and saying, this is not pottery. This is white stone, and listed out what they found in it. Like I mentioned, fragments of all these semi-precious stones. Evidence of, there was a water line. There was evidence of the blood of a bull or cow. There was evidence of, a lot of things, ashes. They even found a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of red fiber. Those of us who know scripture say, wow, that's amazing. And they estimated it was 3,300 years old, exactly to the time of the Exodus. This is the 7th article of the sanctuary. We have 6. We ended up thinking when we were going through the tabernacles, and how many pieces of furniture in there? I said, well, it would make sense to have 7. That's the perfect number of the Father's plan. It's like, no, there's only 6. It was right after that we ended up getting information about the vessel. It's like, oh my. Well, the voice really said something interesting. This was crafted by Yahuwah, painted by Moses, and used by Aaron for the cleansing of the people. Now go study. Fascinating. In our time, many things are going to happen, I think, to help people understand that these stories are not just fables. As I was reading for this presentation, they say they really have hardly any evidence that there was a crossing of the Red Sea. Really? Ron Wyatt was finding all these gold wheels down at the, bottom of the sea. If you're a skeptic, you're going to ignore all the data. That you won't convince a person whether you show them data or not. The same thing with them going to Mount Sinai and many other things that went on. They basically say, we really don't have any real evidence about this happening. The only record is the scriptures. Is it true? Interesting. Well, starting in with this context of where they were 3,300 years ago, and the timing of these things happening in the spring of the year, we have now to just go back to Miriam. She's first mentioned in Exodus 2. And it's the story, very familiar to every child almost, about baby Moses, right? How he was put into a little basket boat that his mother crafted and was hidden amongst the rushes on the edge of the Nile. And his sister watched over him. Now, this is an interesting thing because we assume she's fairly old then. No. In Eastern countries, it's not uncommon to see kids who are just, maybe 5 years old, carrying around their 1-year-old sibling. They're babysitting. They're very responsible. Kids in other countries like Asia, India, children are put to work in family businesses that require excellent eyesight. By the time they're about 11 or 12, their eyes aren't good enough to do it anymore. The parents rely on the children who have good eyesight to do these things. So what are they doing? They're doing absolutely intricate stitching with gold thread and stuff on these beautiful saris that they use for weddings and everything. We would say child labor, but they are providing an element of something that helps their families survive. And these businesses go from father to son and father to son, and they've been there for hundreds of years. This is actually the way that other countries have always existed, where the children are an active part in providing for the family and doing things that are necessary, herding sheep and goats, and you see this all over India, little boys with their little herd, they're gotta watch that. They might take a little lunch like the boy with his loaves and fishes or whatever. Young kids, that's their responsibility to make sure that the family, animals are safe and that they don't have any of them lost. They learn responsibility at a very young time. And so here's Miriam. They estimate she might have been 6 or 7. That's not very old. And when you see what she did, she was not thinking like the 6 or 7-year-old that we have in our culture, that all they're thinking about is, little games where you're stacking blocks. And no, kids actually then were very, very, and it shows that our intellect is not really, how would I say, we don't teach our children things that are too complex, and they're capable actually of knowing a lot of things that we don't think they can. There was 2 years between Moses and Aaron, we understand, but Miriam was the older one, but she was probably 6 or 7. And Jewish tradition states she was 126 when she died. They keep track of things like this, just like we know. Maybe great-great-great-grandmother, we're told in our family times, oh, she did this, she did that. Do you doubt that? No, it's coming down through the family, right? And it's like a family story. And even though it might not have been written down somewhere, it's still considered a truth. And so a lot of their traditions give us insights into things in the Bible that the Bible doesn't clearly state. Exodus 6, verse 20, and also Numbers 3 and Numbers 26 tell us that Miriam and Moses were the children of Amram. It's not listed in the original part there at the beginning where you have the story of Miriam watching her brother. But it tells us later on that these were the daughters of Amram, whose name means exalted people. That's interesting. His parents had a vision for him, because names in the Bible reflect a parent's desire for their child, or if their name came from Yahweh, it was something that was prophetic, something that had to do with the mission that he expected them or wanted them to accomplish. Just like with Yeshua, his name means salvation of Yah, right? Now, could his father actually make sure that that's what he did? No. Like we see with Samson, he did his own thing. He had power of choice. Well, here they named their children interesting things. And so Amram, his parents probably had very, very high expectations for him, and they called his name exalted people. And Yocheved, or Yocheved in Hebrew, their mother, was actually Amram's father's sister, his aunt. Now immediately we say, oh, that's a strange arrangement, this older one. No, they had such big families that probably this aunt was probably younger than he. They had children until they couldn't have children anymore. And so it's not that strange in the Bible for people to marry, fairly close relatives. They were then assured that they were of God's people. Now we know that Levites really were required, and that rule had not been made yet, but they were sort of expected to marry within their tribe. And so Jochebed and Amram were both from Levi. And her name meant Yahuwah is glory. Lovely names. Why do we name our kids things that don't have any meaning? Just something we like, But one I'd never heard before was Gary's daughter is named, or his granddaughter is named Everest. Really? You name yourself after a mountain or a city. You could call it Denver or something else. Why do we name our children names that are meaningless instead of looking for something that we desire them to be? or having some other, maybe a favorite family member that you're honoring or something like that would make more sense too. We have crazy names. Do you know what Elon Musk's son's name is? Go figure. Crazy. Miriam. The name can be interpreted as meaning bitterness or rebellion. I thought, ooh, why would one name a child that? But actually, there is a root meaning in the Egyptian language that suggests beloved or love. So I have a feeling that they were maybe influenced by their surroundings.
Meant what?
Meant beloved or love. And that would make more sense. But it's interesting that Miriam went through something in her life that kind of made this other meaning of her name come alive. She had the responsibility to watch over her baby brother from afar, right? And the scripture tells us the story, and it's in all the children's books. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile River to bathe, and she saw the reed basket that Moses' mother had made and placed him in an attempt to hide and save him. And as the princess and her maids opened the basket, they discussed the possibility of him being a Hebrew child. He was a beautiful child, it says, in the Hebrew. Beautiful of countenance and stuff. So he was a very attractive baby boy. And Miriam watched, and she perceived that this child was being spoken of in a kind way. Ellen White tells us that. And ventured near and said at last, well, shall I go and call a nurse of the Hebrew women that she can nurse this child for you? And of course, the princess said, yes, of course. She probably heard the whole dialogue, And it sounds like this princess did not have children and maybe wasn't even married, but was attracted to this child. Maybe because of the father's promptings in her heart. So Miriam went and told her mother the news, and without delay, she returned with her mother to Pharaoh's daughter, and she was instructed, take the child away and nurse him for me, and I'll give you your wages. So what a blessing that they no longer had to worry about Moses, number one, being killed, but it became a support for the family. Now, many years go by, and when Moses was 40, we know he went to live with Pharaoh's daughter at the age of accountability, we're told, and Ellen White says about 12 years of age, but the Bible doesn't tell us that. But his mother had enough time to teach him truth. Kids can know the truth at a very early age. The system of the world kind of feels like, oh, let the kid do whatever they want to do until, they finally seem to be able to take instruction. No, a newborn needs control. You'll have a child that runs you ragged if you don't start to discipline a child from the get-go. You can't allow them to be throwing food around and having temper tantrums and all this kind of stuff. It will be a part of their character, because what does Ellen White tell us? Character is actually gelling and almost fixed by the time a child is 4 and 5 years of age. We don't have a lot of time as mothers to do a very, very important job, and that is to train our children to grow up in the fear of the Lord. It's a very important job, and women who have to work, as what's happened since World War II in America, has been the destroying of the family. It's been an element that Satan put in there, I think, deliberately, and we find this in the writings of the Jesuits and things that is something they had to dissolve, and that is the Protestant family. And they've done a very good job of it. Along with, the rock music movement and the things that went on with the hippies, all of this stuff was really pre-planned in a very, very interesting way. We don't always understand that there's motive behind all of this. And we have to fight against those things. It's very difficult, but we're going to have to. It's getting even worse now. I don't think I would want to be a mom with a young baby today. It's really difficult to raise children in this generation. But here, when Moses was 40, after living in Pharaoh's court, having all of that knowledge given to him to make him possibly an heir to the throne, and so he learned all the things of Egypt, probably even they were trying to make him understand their religion as well. But we're told in the spirit of prophecy that he asked them questions and said things that the priests that were teaching him really were frustrated. They didn't know how to deal with it. So obviously his mother did a good job. And we're told by Paul that he chose at a very young age to serve Elohim and to not be a part of the pagan culture of Egypt. He was considered a son of Pharaoh's daughter, and I'm sure that in time she was very hurt when the Bible says that he determined not to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter and to align himself with God's people. Now, why am I talking so much about Moses? Moses was not immersed in the culture that his sister had been all of her life, right? He had been put in a very, very trying situation, but in a sense, God had purpose in that he had a very strong attachment to Yahweh, especially through those years where he tended sheep. And we know that's when he wrote the book of Genesis. Now, people out in the scholarly world want to question that. Ellen White says that's what he did, that he would sit out there under the stars, and like Kimber was saying, he is an awesome God, and he just was drinking in the immensity of creation out there in the wilderness. Any of you who live out in the wide open spaces of the West, it's far different the feeling you get than you get when you're closed in with all the trees and the hills of the East Coast. And people who've lived there all their life, they don't feel good in this environment. They like that expansive, feeling. And that's the feeling we get when we contemplate our Father. He's immense. He's gadol. He's great. And so here was Moses immersed in that and writing and connecting with God, talking to him, praying with him. And in the meantime, his sister was getting older, right? We don't think of Miriam. And she was, the first time we see her, she's this little kid, but the next time she's talked about, it was at the crossing of the Red Sea, right? How old was she then? Think about it. If Moses had spent 40 years in the court, and he went and spent 40 years in the wilderness, he was 80 years old. We know that, right? How old would Miriam have been? Add another 6 or 7 years, she's almost 90. And she's out there with her tambourine, and she's playing with the women and praising Yahweh, and talk about energy. But that's really the picture we get when we start to look at the story from a different standpoint. And when Moses was in Midian, he had a divine appointment at a well. How many divine appointments have been at wells throughout the scriptures? That's an interesting, sermon. But he had fled, and he met Jethro's 7 girls who were herding sheep, and they took him home, and he ended up marrying probably his eldest daughter, because that was the custom. You don't marry off the younger girls before you marry off the older ones. And we see that with Jacob's life. There was a problem because Laban did that to him, right? Giving him Leah first. The name of that daughter was Zipporah. Zipporah, and it means little bird. But it has an interesting meaning that kind of comes from that. It evokes a sense of beauty and grace and freedom. Zipporah was a very intelligent woman, but probably very quiet, very, deep thinking. And Ellen White shares in Patriarchs and Prophets a situation there that started out with, they'll call it a Cushite woman. This is what Numbers 12 tells us. That she was a Cushite. The wife of Moses was a Midianite, and thus a descendant of Abraham. She was not a pagan. She was a person who had grown up in a home that worshipped Yahweh. Jethro was a priest of Elohim, and a prince, it says. So he probably had quite an area where he maybe, I wouldn't say ruled, but he was maybe the chieftain of an area there. And so this was not just a woman that he just picked up and she was a pagan. In personal appearance, she differed from the Hebrews in a somewhat darker complexion, Ellen White tells us. Though not an Israelite, Zipporah was a worshiper of the true God. She was of a timid kind of spirit, but a wonderful person that Moses married. And she started out for Egypt with Moses, but returned and remained to her father's house. And there's some stories there we won't get into, but she called Moses a husband of blood. So it kind of makes you wonder if these rights that Abraham was given as a sign of the covenant to circumcise all of the people in his household, not just his children, really had made a big impact on Jethro's family. We don't know. But basically, evidently, one of their children or sons was circumcised and one was not. And how could Moses lead a people and ask them to be obedient to Yahweh if he himself had some things in his family life that were not? And that's really what that was all about. It was like Yahweh said, you need to get this done. And Zipporah, I think maybe understanding what that was all about finally, I think she was the one that talked him into not doing that, maybe. We don't know. Her son was circumcised. And she and the boys went back home because I think maybe Moses got to thinking about that. There's going to be some real issues that are going to go on in Egypt, and probably it's not a good environment for my sons and my wife. So she went back home. She remained in her father's house till Jethro brought her and their two sons to the camp of Israel to be reunited with Moses. And this was almost when they were at the mountain, 7 weeks after leaving Egypt. Now, we did talk about the time of the Exodus and Moses being 80 years old when they left, Aaron 82 and Miriam about 86. After the plagues and the total destruction of the land, Israel, led by Moses and Aaron, left Egypt in the early morning of the first day of unleavened bread and journeyed nonstop, which would have been the 15th day, right? They journeyed nonstop to the Red Sea, the Bible tells us. The cloud by day and the fire by night was there for them to be able to journey. And they arrived at the sea with children, with elderly, with animals, 7 days. That's miraculous. That's miraculous. Why wasn't Israel thinking about these things? I'm not tired. Or we've made this and we've had no interference or anything. Father's here with us. But we then have the account of that amazing chase of Pharaoh, right? And his army to try and undo their liberation and turn the escaped slaves back to Egypt. And it failed miserably, as the story of the crossing of the Red Sea details. We're told, this is a quote from Spirit of Prophecy, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and the cloud and troubled the host of the Egyptians. Now that is probably reading from a translation of Scripture. I think she liked the American Standard or one of those. Thunders pealed and lightnings flashed. The Egyptians were seized with confusion. They endeavored to retrace their steps, but Moses stretched out his rod, and the piled up waters rushed together and swallowed the Egyptian army in their black depths. As morning broke, it revealed to Israel all that remained of their mighty foe. Mail-clad bodies cast upon the shore. That's an interesting thing to me. If you're wearing 50 pounds or more of mail, wouldn't you think? Was the Father allowing enough evidence for them to look at and say, wow, was that water so turbulent that it just, pushed all this onto the shore? I think so. But in normal circumstances, that wouldn't happen. And from the most terrible peril, Jehovah, as she always uses that word, had brought complete deliverance. And I find that interesting because if you just change that J to a Y, Yehovah, Yahuwah, V and W are the same in Hebrew. So, she was using the sacred name as she understood it. She wasn't using God or Lord in these circumstances. It's interesting. He had brought complete deliverance to them, and to him their hearts were turned in gratitude and faith. The Spirit of God rested upon Moses, and he led the people in a triumphant anthem of thanksgiving. Now, we think that was all Miriam. No, Moses was the one who was inspired with this anthem of thanksgiving. But what did Miriam do? She took up the joy of this sublime moment, and She and the women of Israel following her went and forth, and they had their timbrels and their dance, and far over the desert and sea rang this joyful noise, their songs, and the mountains re-echoed the words of their praise. What a beautiful picture. They were so happy for their deliverance. Sing ye to Yahuwah, for he has triumphed gloriously. And there are people today who've actually written songs about this that people use for Passover. It's a nice song. That song does not belong to the Jewish people alone. It points forward to the destruction of all the foes of righteousness and the final victory of the God of Israel. Now, Ellen White does not address the the stuff that went on in Deuteronomy at the end of Moses' life, when they were at the borders of the Promised Land. Moses was requested to write a song and teach it to the people. Is that the Song of Moses that's being referred to in Revelation, or is it the one at the sea? I think both of them are wonderful, but the one in Deuteronomy, we don't have time to go through it. Read it sometime. It goes into all an understanding of all that they went through and all of that there was victory. So to me, that one really is one that probably would be telling the whole story instead of part of it. In freeing our souls from the bondage of sin, God has wrought for us a deliverance greater than that of the Hebrews at the Red Sea. Like the Hebrew host, we should praise the Lord with heart and soul and voice, she says, for his wonderful works to the children of men. What compassion, what matchless love has God shown in connecting us with himself to be, to him, a peculiar treasure. It wasn't just the children of Israel of old who is his segula. Ellen White uses the word spiritual Israel all the time. That's who we are. We carry on the same mandate, the same commissioning. The three angels' message, taking the gospel to the world, being salt, being light, as they were given in the Old Testament. This is not a New Testament thing, as I said. This is a thing that's a part of all of God's people throughout every generation. By our lifestyle, by our, not just our words, not just by handing out books and things like that. Our life is a wonderful thing that speaks loudly of what God will do in our lives, right? And I think that impacts people a lot more than other things we want to do. What compassion, what matchless love, I said, has God shown in connecting us with himself, to be to him a peculiar treasure. What a sacrifice has been made by our Savior that we may be called children of God. In Deuteronomy 31, I mentioned this song. And I would really like to say, if they were never to forget to observe all the words of Yahuwah's law, which is a part of that song, maybe we ought to make that song a part of what we do ourselves and learn it and contemplate it, because that's the purpose that God wanted for his people that was expressed in that. Now we get to some difficult times, because as they went through the Red Sea and they actually saw miracles, like I said, the third day out, they had problems with water. 10 days out, they had other problems. Very, very near to the crossing of the Red Sea, some of these things were starting to emerge. And as Moses and the children of Israel arrived at the mountain, Zipporah and their sons were reunited, as I said, with Moses, and there was friction that was developing between Miriam and Zipporah. In Israelite culture, and in cultures of the rest of the other third world countries, it's not Western culture. Western culture is actually extremely pagan. I don't know if you understand that. Even in our customs of how we marry and all of that, this is not biblical at all. In the Bible, we have a betrothal that was done, and it was something that the families were involved in. Mothers and fathers of both the boy and the girl. Some of these kids were so young, they might be newborns. And the families say, we are so close, I want my daughter to marry your son. And they go through a betrothal ceremony with the signing of a legal document, and she is his wife and he is her husband from the time they're little, and they know it. It's like, that's my husband when I get old enough to be having a home of my own. We're married. We'd say, what? But basically from that time on, it was any time in that time frame when there was family involvement in who was going to marry who in a family. Don't you think there's wisdom in that? You have parents who know the child inside out, and those parents might talk and say, well, my daughter's like this, and say, well, my son's like that, and I actually see him. Yes, he's in school and he does this and that. Well, he's very industrious, and he's going to make a good wife for husband for my daughter. And they talk about these things, and so there was a consensus that was obviously a part of what the child wanted. They were not doing uh, like we had in India with Hinduism. These are not arranged marriages like the pagans do. They were alliances between families that were healthy and good and expected to be successful. And you know what? The divorce rates among the Jews is very, very low. Did you know that? Even today. Their numbers have changed a bit because you have a lot of people who are atheistic and they're still Jews. Why? Because their blood is Jewish, but it's not pure. And so there are many, many who are embracing Hinduism, Buddhism, you name it. But if they embrace Christianity, they're cut off. You can be anything else. Don't you dare be a Christian. Why? Because of the reputation that Christianity has had in their lives for millennia. Killing us, talking bad about us, trying to change us, all these things affect their attitude towards Christianity, and it was done a lot by the Roman Catholic Church, right? The Crusades, the pogroms they went through, many of those were instigated by Catholicism. Sadly to say, that's the only Christian church they relate to. So when they end up having people like Jews for Jesus or Messianic groups that believe in Yeshua, they absolutely go like this when you talk about Jesus. Yeshua, they understand that word, and I hear it all the time in the synagogue services I might listen to. Why? Because it means deliverance, it means redemption. So it's everywhere. And when the Jewish young man who came and joined our Bible study group after, he actually brought himself into an understanding of Messiah through Scripture alone, and he was thrown out of his house because of that. And his parents did all the things that you do when a person dies in your family. Cover the mirrors, throw out the water, all the things that are in Leviticus, by the way. He had to leave home, but he believed what he read. And he said, but Dad, I believe this is true. He said that they always talked about their ancestors as though they lived next door. Previous generations were still very alive in their lives. And they every year will have remembrance times. And they do this every Friday evening in the synagogue. They remember people who have passed away. They remember people if it was within the last 7 days, or when it was the last month, or when it was longer. And they celebrate anniversaries of people's death. They don't want their memory to ever fade in their minds. It's not like they're worshiping the dead. We sometimes completely misunderstand other cultures because we don't delve into it deeply enough. We just see what's on the surface. Like you see the Yarex candles. It's like, oh, that's kind of like the Catholic people who put candles for their. Where did they get that from? They got it from Judaism. But they completely have different meaning to what they do. So here we had this marriage that happened outside the family context, right? And the family members had no input into what happened with Moses marrying Zipporah. And having darker skin, she was not an Ethiopian, as some people want to say. But basically, this displeased Miriam. And that he should choose a woman of another nation instead of taking a wife from among the Hebrews. Well, she was not realizing that she was a descendant of Abraham. So it was like an offense to her family and national pride. And national pride gets in the way a lot in the nation of Israel, to the point that they want to keep everybody else out. They're the ones that receive the law. They're the ones that receive the Sabbath. Oh, all of you Christians, you can keep the Noahide laws, but the Sabbath is for us. No, this attitude doesn't allow others to know the truth, right? They weren't being light, they weren't being salt. And so Zipporah was treated with ill-disguised contempt, Ellen White says. How sad. We're also told in Numbers 20 that Miriam was very talented and gifted in many ways, but jealousy of her position with Moses led her to make some serious mistakes. So it wasn't just jealousy or contempt for Zipporah as being somebody outside of Israel in her thinking, but it was also she was jealous of Moses. Now she was his older sister, right? And she might have had a lot to do. Ellen White says that she had a lot to do with the deliverance of God's people from Israel. So was she an example of good things and a good organizer? And who knows? We're not told. But she stood second only to Moses and Aaron, Ellen White tells us. So why was she coveting Moses' role that was given to him by God, right? Let's think about this. The same evil that first brought discord in heaven, she says, sprang up in the heart of this woman of Israel. And she did not fail to find a sympathizer in her dissatisfaction. And who was that? Her brother, Aaron. Now, it might not have started that way. She might have been frustrated and came to her brother to talk to him, but he did not say, Zipporah is his wife. Don't go on with this. Or calm her down. Women get kind of worked up emotionally. Men are a little more level-headed at times like that. And he could have taken that bull by the horns and said, Miriam, what's done is done. Let's just, God's done wonderful things for us. Let's just move on. She's a believer. These things are so interesting. There was some dynamics that is shared by Ellen White. She says, when Zipporah rejoined her husband in the wilderness, she saw that his burdens were wearying him, right? Wearing away his strength. And she made known her fears to Jethro, who suggested measures for his relief. Jethro hadn't thought that up himself. Zipporah, with her sensitivity to her husband, had mentioned to her dad, there's something here that needs to change. And so here was the chief reason for Miriam's antipathy to Zipporah. She regarded the wife of Moses as the cause of the supposed neglect shown to herself and Aaron. Well, why wasn't Moses going to pay attention to his wife? He'd been separated from her throughout these 2 to 3, we don't know how long the plagues went on. It was fairly short. I don't think it was years. But basically, he was separated from his children and his wife. And so that's the natural thing. You're going to pay attention to your wife other than your sister or your brother. Do you have equal time with them? No. It's being unreasonable, right? Had Aaron stood firmly for the right, as we said, he might have checked the evil, but instead of showing Miriam the sinfulness of her conduct, he sympathized with her and thus came to share her jealousy. Does this start to show us the weak nature of Aaron's character that went on and flowered when he ended up giving in to the people's request to make them a golden calf? Yes, he was not a strong person spiritually and able to stand up to people. But how many people do you know that have a very kind nature and they just don't want to rock the boat, they don't want to make waves? They just sit their mouth shut when things come up that maybe need to be addressed. That can cause problems in families, in marital relationships, with children, with all kinds of things. We have to be able to learn how to communicate things that are right and wrong, right? In a kind way, though. God had chosen Moses and had put his spirit upon him. And Miriam and Aaron, by their murmurings, were guilty of disloyalty, not only to their appointed leader, but to God himself, she says. But in the appointment of the 7 elders, Miriam and Aaron had not been consulted. Did they need to be? And their jealousy was excited against Moses. They felt that their position and authority had been ignored. They regarded themselves as sharing equally with him the burden of leadership and regarded the appointment of further assistance as uncalled for. What was God doing? He was creating a government for a whole nation of how many people at that time? 2.5 to 3 million is the estimates. Are you going to have a triumvirate at the top like is in Rome and here and there? No. The Father wanted a government that was fair, that utilized, as he did, leaders of tens, leaders of hundreds, leaders of thousands. He was putting up a system that would work well no matter how big Israel would be, right? When they got into the land, they would already have a form of government that was organized and would work. And they needed it in the wilderness as well. Moses realized his own weakness and made God his counselor. Aaron esteemed himself more highly and trusted less in God. Sir Ellen White's words, very insightful. He had failed in the matter of the idolatrous worship at Sinai, but Miriam and Aaron, blinded by jealousy and ambition, said, "Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us?" The seditious whisperers were summoned to the tabernacle and brought face to face with Moses. Now, doesn't the Bible say if somebody has aught against you, go to them? So they were actually applying the things that were given by Christ's own mouth in the New Testament, saying this is the way things should be solved. You don't go talking behind people's back. You go to them and say, I need some better understanding of this situation. And so Gary and I ended up telling you all what we're all about up at the farm because some questioned. And I say that kindly. Why don't you come to us, talk to us about, find out what the whole situation is. We have a ministry that we share. But there's no hanky-panky going on between us. He's got his camper, I have mine. We're working for y'all together. And now John has joined us. I'm glad for that. I wish some women would join too. I'd love that. Then I could share cooking responsibilities and laundry and all this stuff with somebody. Anyway, you see, these situations occur in our society as well as back then, and it's not changed. So Yahuwah came down in a pillar of the cloud as he brought them face to face with Moses at the entrance of the tabernacle and stood at the door. Now it says Yahuwah came down in that pillar of cloud and stood at the door of the tabernacle. What was this, a bright light that was visibly there? Or was Yeshua himself manifesting himself in some other way? We don't have. It just says that he came down and stood at the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam. Their claim to the prophetic gift was not denied. God might have spoken to them in visions and dreams. But to Moses, whom the Lord himself declared faithful in all my house, a nearer communion had been granted. With him, Yahuwah spoke mouth to mouth, face to face, right? That means panei on panei. Wherefore then were you not afraid, he said, to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and it says he departed. He departed. The cloud disappeared from the tabernacle in token of God's displeasure. Wow, so the whole camp knew something's going on. And Miriam was smitten. She became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron was spared. He might have only been a patient brother listening and responding to Miriam, who was sharing her thoughts and feelings with him, but in a sense that was wrong, wasn't it? He was severely rebuked in Miriam's punishment. Now, their pride humbled in the dust, Aaron did the right thing. He confessed their sin and entreated that his sister might not be left to perish by that loathsome and deadly scourge. In answer to the prayer of who? Of Moses. Moses was the intercessor many, many times for Israel. This was for his own sister. The leprosy was cleansed, but there were consequences. Miriam was shut out of the camp for 7 days. And I don't believe that the leprosy was cleansed instantaneously when Moses prayed. I think it happened after she had to leave the camp for 7 days. This is actually a lesson to us. I have a Korean friend, a very dear sister of mine. Her daughter was being extremely controlling and was objecting to her keeping the feasts and wanting to take the Bible as it reads. And Lois ended up leaving the home of her daughter and came over and stayed in our Landrum house, which was empty at the time. And my mother went over and stayed with her because she says, she came over to our home actually crying and saying, my daughter's saying, you're my family. You're my family. And we said, that's fine, Lois. Yes, you are our family. She's my sister. And so she stayed with my mom over at the old house. There was still some beds there and stuff. And so they stayed over there. Lois had some extremely interesting insight when she came to the group and study time on Sabbath and said, my daughter is outside the camp. She has leprosy. And if Miriam had to be outside the camp because she was disrespectful to her brother, my daughter is being disrespectful to me, and I've left. So after a few days, her daughter says, Mom, please come home. The kids miss you. Oh, after a few days, it was like, Mom, please come home. Well, why was she insistent? She did all the washing. She did all the cooking. She did all the babysitting of these young children. She did everything. She missed her presence and all the things she did. And it changed her heart. She was begging then for Mom to come home. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm not going to say anything more about the way you want to believe and all this stuff. It was many, many, many years like that, but there's problems still there. But she took this incident in the Old Testament and applied it to her own situation, which I think was apropos, right? Numbers 5, 19 and 19, 11 through 13 are the chapters where the process of cleansing for leprosy and other uncleanness, for example, discharges defiled for being around a dead body or just being around a person who was unclean, spiritually maybe even. They were told, do not be around people who are going to affect you spiritually, right? You're a set apart, peculiar people, but that doesn't mean odd. It means you're my peculiar people. You have a lifestyle I have given you that will not allow you to be influenced by them. Don't do it. I had a brother who ended up marrying a girl who was a meat eater. We grew up vegetarian for 3 generations. He started eating hamburgers with her just because he loves her. It was a lesson to me. Now, you can't criticize. You just basically have to say, well, why are you doing that, And see what his answer is. But are we trying to please our spouse? Are we trying to please Yah? Are we trying to live according to the light that we have? No, we can't force other people, even in our family, to do that. If you're a mom and dad, you're trying your best to be an example to your children and give them what's good, and hopefully the habits will stick, right? But choice is always there. So I understand this idea. We have got to be following what we know is right, but in a kind way. We don't want to make people just sick and tired of having us around because we're constantly preaching to them or making them feel like we're better than they are, or you know what I'm saying? We can't do that. The way that you end up winning people to Christ is to live a life that is exemplary and that they say, I wish I could live like that. And they come and say, I want to know what you know. That's what we really want. So this process of cleansing, though, was a system of cleansing that the Father gave that's full of spiritual meaning. They were sent out of the camp. On the 3rd day, they were sprinkled with water. On the 7th day, they were pronounced clean, if they were healed, right? But they had to be out there that amount of time. There's spiritual lessons to that. We talked about 3 when I talked about, what does 3 mean? Anybody remember? By 2 or 3, a legal matter is determined. This was a legal matter with Yahweh. Leprosy is a representation of sin. And this person who had gone and presented themselves to the priest had to have these things verified in a legal way so that they could come back into the community of faith. And so by 3, that was established. They were sprinkled with water, cleansing, baptism, mikvah, as it's said in the Bible. So if we do a sin, can we just say, oh, but I was baptized 20 years ago? Is this maybe something also pertinent to us to go through the process of being washed and being clean? It wasn't just a mental process. It was actually physical. That's the lesson that shows the spiritual aspect. And on the 7th day, they were pronounced clean by the priest, right? Not until she was banished from the encampment did the symbol of God's favor again rest upon the tabernacle. In respect for her high position and in grief at the blow that had fallen upon her, the whole company abode at Hazeroth, waiting for her return. She was outside the camp, literally. This manifestation of the Lord's displeasure was designed to be a warning to all Israel to check the growing spirit of discontent and insubordination. Now, as we had done a little bit of pre-conversation here, they'd already had some of this boiling up, right? Amongst the people that were the mixed multitude, and there was feelings of discontent were starting in, evidently, within Israel itself. And so the Father was teaching a lesson here. He took one of his leadership to show them graphically, I will deal with all of you. They're not exempt, right? Nobody's better than anybody else here. We see this happen even today when you see leadership brought into the spotlight for things that they have done wrong. And there has to be public confession, right? They deal with the public has to be aware that there's confession and change of heart. You can't just take them and quietly change their location and put them somewhere else and keep it quiet. That's been a lot of what's happened within the church. This is wrong.
Amen.
You know, there are people in other faiths. I think of Jerry Falwell, years ago, who ended up being unfaithful to his wife. He had to get on television, that was his ministry, and confess and say, I was wrong and I want forgiveness. And he has gone on in ministry, and that scourge has not been a part of that ministry as a result of him just zipping his mouth and going doing something else. That's a brave act to do, but it's necessary. It was necessary of Moses and Aaron and of Miriam. And we'll talk about Moses and Aaron later because they also went through some of this, right? If Miriam's envy and dissatisfaction had not been signally rebuked, Ellen White says, it would have resulted in great evil. Envy is one of the most satanic traits that can exist in the human heart. Did you realize that? Envy and coveting is hand in hand with that, right? If you envy somebody else, what they have, what they are, how they look, I don't care what it is, that is coveting in a way. And that's why Paul said, when I learned about coveting, basically all of the commandments deal with that. You know, and that's the truth. It's kind of a pivotal concept that takes in the whole human heart. It's so wicked. And she said it's one of the most baleful in its effects. It was envy that first caused discord in heaven, wasn't Lucifer envious of Yeshua? Yeah. He says, why am I not included, right? And these things have terrible, terrible fruit. And she says its indulgence has wrought untold evil among men. Why didn't wars start most of the time, especially wars in the old world? It's covetousness, right? More territory. They wanted more slaves. They wanted to control. They wanted tribute. They wanted more money. All of this stuff had to do with wars and conquering other people. You know, we have the same thing going on in the world today, but it's sort of on a different level. It's perceived in a different way. Banks do it. What are the interest rates right now for a credit card for most people? If you're not smart and you go get one of them,
Obscene.
it is obscene. I like that word because it's terrible. And actually, this particular administration has been addressing that and confronting banks and saying, what's your interest rate? And they're embarrassed to say. Some of them are worth 30%. Look, what is that? It's robbery. They know people's lives are tight. They know the economy is not good. And sometimes people have emergencies. Say they have a car and that's their only way of getting to work and their car breaks down. What do they have to do as a desperate move? Put the repairs on their credit card, and then they don't have the money to pay it off. Then they're paying this high interest. They're getting interest from everybody. It is absolute robbery. And they're calling it that. Well, good for them. We are actually, and I said this to somebody before Passover, we are slaves in Babylon. We're mathematical slaves. If people do not calculate what it costs them when they buy a house and figure out a way to pay the house off in less time, they pay double for that house over 30 years. If you pay it over in 15 years, you're paying almost half of that or more. If you pay it off cash, you don't pay any of it, but it requires saving. But houses today are so expensive. Who's going to save $200,000 or in Seattle $600,000 for a house that is just sort of mediocre? We're living in slavery in Babylon. We have to see these things. But envy and strife is, where all this happens, and there is confusion in every evil work, we're told, James 3:16. The Bible teaches us to beware of lightly bringing accusations against those whom God has called to act as his ambassadors. And who are those in today's world? Our pastors, our leaders, right? It also has to do with things like the leaders of tens or families, parents, people who are influential in your life. We need to find out and communicate and find out if there's a problem that we think is there. Don't you think some of that would be solved in a very easy way by just going and talking to them? That's what we need to start first. And the Bible says that in the New Testament. If anyone has aught against you, what do? You go to them. You go to them. That's the first step, right? And it gives other steps. If they're not going to listen, then you take somebody else. And there is a peaceful way of dealing with these things. And all the gossip and all the evil talk and talking behind people's back accomplishes nothing but evil, right? And that's what Timothy says in chapter 5, verse 19. It says, against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. These are wise things that the Bible tells us of how we deal with conflict. He who has placed upon men the responsibility of leaders and teachers of his people will hold the people accountable for the manner in which they treat his servants. That's a pretty heavy statement. Just like Miriam, who got leprosy for her accusations against her brother, we can incur, the disfavor of God if we do the same thing. The judgment visited upon Miriam should be a rebuke to all who yield to jealousy and murmur against those upon whom God lays the burden of his work. And that's whatever it is. There are independent ministries. There are people who are doing work amongst the homeless. There's all kinds of things. It could be individual. It can be group things. It could be things the church does. It could be institutions that are built up. But, we have to be kind and we should be discerning. And if we have an issue, then talk about it with the right source, right? Numbers 20 is where we are. It's interesting how after this incident with Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, they all of a sudden had all kinds of bad things happening. Did Miriam open a Pandora's box? Yes, she did. She was a leader and her example was very bad. The children of Israel, in verse 1, came into the wilderness of sin again. Here at Kadesh, Miriam died and was buried, it tells us. And from that scene of rejoicing on the shores of the Red Sea, when Israel went forth with song and dance to celebrate Yahuwah's triumph in the wilderness grave, to the wilderness grave, I should say, which ended a lifelong wandering. Her life ended there. Such has been the fate of millions who with high hopes had come forth from Egypt. Sin had dashed from their lips the cup of blessing, and what says in Patriarchs of Prophets. Now, I truly believe Miriam repented. I believe that she will be in the kingdom, along with her brother. And yet, what pain she went through with that whole experience, it could have been avoided. In verses 2 through 13, it goes on to describe the rebellion. I'm not going to read the whole chapter because it would take more time, but it described a rebellion and an unbelief that ensued when tested again with no water. This taxed Moses and Aaron's patience and caused them to sin by this time, striking the rock instead of speaking to it as they were instructed. You can harass your leadership to the point that you cause them to sin. Did you think about that? I guess living in the mission field where they put you up on a pedestal, any white face, it's like they expect you to be able to do anything. And then they get very, very disappointed if you say anything or you do anything that they think, ooh. Let me give you a funny example. It wasn't so funny, but it is here in this thing. We have colloquialisms in English, right? We use them. Well, I was director in Bangladesh of ADRA, and one of his workers went out in the field, did something really stupid, and it was not a good thing. Instead of chewing him out, I was a very mild person and said, "You turkey, why did you do that?" And he said, "He called me a bird." And that went all over the union office and loud. Oh my goodness. I was really saying something kind of mild, just sort of saying, "Why did you do that?" Because that's what that means in our vernacular, right? He had to apologize and say, "No, in English in America, this means such and such." But we can do this so easily in foreign settings. You can say something when you're learning the language and find out it was foul language. And for us, it was, we didn't understand. We have to watch our speech. We have to be very, very circumspect and careful and patient and kind and long suffering. Otherwise, people react in very, very strong ways to what they don't understand. They don't put us on the same level as themselves. You wish they would. We're no different than they are. But you find out very quickly that you have too many people looking at you and you need to live in a different way. Your head sticking up out of the sand is ready to be cut off. You're not one of the masses that you'd like to be. And I remember as a child, being third generation missionary, Dad, how come I can't just live my life like every other kid, learning my own mistakes and I have to live to a standard that, isn't necessarily maybe mine. I'm growing up and I have ideas and stuff. And yet my parents never said, "That's too bad, you have to do. They didn't do that. But you learn those lessons sometimes the hard way, and you have to learn to watch your tongue, watch your actions, and always be able to talk about what you're doing and not be embarrassed or not be, whatever. Our lives are viewed by the world. You might not realize it, but when you go to Walmart and you're impatient, or you bump in from front of somebody else's, maybe you're reaching to get something that they're actually coming for too. I mean, it might be something simple like that. But instead of saying, "Oh, excuse me, go ahead," we have an attitude of graciousness that we're expected to exude all the time. Doesn't matter who, whether it's the homeless. And that was one of the things that I was told as I dealt with homeless people for about 10 years. That's what they saw. I thank the Father for that. But basically, we were not impatient with them. We weren't downing them. We were not, making them feel like so many people do, dirt. And I did mention to you that police officer that called Lisa somebody who was polluting the very air he breathed. That is so rude. Whether this man is a Christian, I don't know. But what kind of an influence do you have on a woman who wants to know more about the Bible, who wants to live a life different, kind of like Mary Magdalene? She'd been abused on the street. She had been raped many times by family members, by brothers, by cousins. She was given drugs, she was given alcohol, she was given cigarettes and all this stuff. Her life was a mess because of what people were doing to her as a child. And then a police officer talks to her like that? Yet her heart was tender. She would find a bicycle in the dumpster that was still workable. She'd give it to a child in the homeless community, saying, "Would you like a bike?" She'd find clothes. She'd find things that were still good that the people had thrown out, and she would give it to people she knew needed it. She was like a Dorcas amongst the homeless people there in Chattanooga. She gave a little box of some stuff when she left the motel. She couldn't stay there any longer. But the woman who was living there had a little boy. And she said, "Here's some stuff I can't take with me." And in it was a little piece of paper with my number on it. This woman got into some massive problems down the line. She called that number and left a message on my phone. "You don't know me, but I got this number from Lisa," and wow. Lisa trusted me. She didn't trust anybody else. And she passed that on, thinking this woman with her child might have a need. And, that really gets your heart. You just realize that people need the Lord. They need loving. And we can't judge. We don't know their circumstances. Excuse me, let me see what I'm doing. Just about something. So we said that this murmuring and this horrible unbelief and rebellion that was going on in the camp was the reason that goaded Moses and Aaron and caused them to strike the rock. Now it's interesting because as I read in scripture, Moses was the one who struck the rock. And yet because Aaron and he were both involved in this situation and standing up there together, both of them died before they went into the promised land. Now isn't that interesting? Sometimes who you're with, and we say this to our children, birds of a feather flock together, right? Don't have friends and acquaintances that are going to be, dragging you into problems. If you get arrested by the cops and you have other people with you, who's all implicated? Everybody, right? So you have to be very careful about your friends. You have to be careful about the things you do. And you can see this from the punishment, if you want to call it that, or the declaration that Yahweh made to Moses and Aaron, you're not going in. The place of that was called Meribah, or Meribah, as we say in English. It's the same letter again in Hebrew. Place of strife or quarrel. And from the root word it comes to contend. To contend. In ancient times, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses with his meekness and wisdom, Joseph, or Joshua, I should say, with his varied capabilities, they were all enlisted in God's service. The music of Miriam, the courage and piety of Deborah, the filial affection of Ruth, the obedience and faithfulness of Samuel, the stern fidelity of Elijah, the softening, subduing influence of Elisha. All were needed. So now all upon whom God's blessing has been bestowed, she says, are to respond by actual service. Every gift is to be employed for the advancement of his kingdom and the glory of his name. These are some of the lessons that Ellen White has brought out for us. But what are the lessons that you and I can glean from the experiences of Miriam? We've done a wonderful thing every time we've done these character studies of the Bible, and I'd like to have a roving mind go around and get your ideas of what you think we as a people need to be like to avoid the things that happened to Miriam. That's why it's there, right? These are for examples of what we're going to go through at the end of time. Anybody have the mic? Ron, is there a mic there?
Yep.
Anybody want to be first with some comment? We've covered quite a bit, but I think that as you might have had experiences, or you might have had situations that would make you think, I went through that and I had to deal with it a certain way, you might be willing to share. Oh, you're all silent.
The situation that comes to mind with me is when the pastor of our church made it his goal, instead of coming to us and talking to us, of getting us pushed out of the church. And I was wounded deeply because we've been leaders there for 25 years. And I took it to the Lord, and I really struggled with it. And the Lord said, pray for him. Pray for his family.
Amen.
Because I knew his family had a lot of issues. So I started praying for him. Pretty soon the Lord said, I want you to do it. And then a little later he said, oh, I'm really, Lord? Really? But he led me step by step by step. Now, we're not best friends, and we never will be. But I can talk with him, and there's none of that left in there.
And don't you think showing grace to a person who's wounded you like that might actually change their mind down the line? You might never know
That's true.
down the line what you might say, oh, wait a minute, he accepted something here? Wow. So we can't give up on people. We don't give up on our children. How many of you read that book about the 30-year Bible or something like that? It was a woman who gave a Bible to her son who went to sea. And she had underlined the important things that she thought were important to her and would be important to him. And he was not, really at the place in his life where he wanted to be religious. He was kind of running away from home almost, wanted his own life, like the prodigal son. And he had that Bible for quite some time, and every once in a while, I thought, oh, well, let's see what Mom put in here. It was a long process, but he finally succumbed to what the Bible was speaking to his heart when he picked it up and looked. Doesn't always happen instantaneously. That was a 30-year period of time. So do we ever stop praying for our children, for our families, for everybody? I mean, anybody that we are impressed to pray for, don't give up. Anybody else? Linda over there.
In that story, I was just kind of thinking, which you brought out quite a bit, about Miriam and Aaron. Aaron sympathized with Miriam, and pretty soon he was in cahoots with her. And I've seen that pattern over and over. First, they just sympathize with them, and then pretty soon they're doing it themselves or believing it themselves. And,
Being
it's
supportive,
whether it's
yeah.
sin. I know Deborah, who first she sympathized with her friend because she was gay. Pretty soon she was doing it. It's the same kind of an issue. It's not good to sympathize with sin.
Exactly. Yeah. Anybody else? Good God.
Yeah, as far as that story you're saying about the 30-day or 30-year Bible, I know